welcome to another Burgundy with Tweedy video. I know I'm in silhouette here, but I just wanted to briefly show you the what vestige of the sunset there is. Bourgogne Rouge, the absolute base level denomination or appellation if you want to use the French pronunciation. It's as unqualified as it gets in terms of the origin of this wine. Geographically, it's just somewhere in Burgundy. But what makes this a bit special, and I have featured this before, is the producer. It is Jean-Marie Fourrier, he of Domaine Fourrier. This is sold under a different label because I think the grapes come through the négociant side of the business. So these are not grapes grown on plots that Jean-Marie Fourrier, as part of Domaine Fourrier, owns himself. They're bought from other growers and then he just does the winemaking. The sort of weird cult status around Jean-Marie Fourrier as a winemaker means that this is still not a cheap bottle of wine. I think this comes in at something like £50 for generic red Burgundy. It's the 2020 vintage, if that makes any difference. Hopefully it gives you something of an idea of the winemaking style of Jean-Marie. A slightly darker colour than I was perhaps expecting. The house style of Jean-Marie Fourrier tends to be relatively light on the extraction, so I was expecting something a bit more sort of translucent. I don't know if it's perhaps this evening light that's confusing me here. Perhaps black cherries on the nose initially. A little bit of black currant, but in a more sort of thick, condensed sort of a way. There might be some subtle floral hints there, maybe a touch of violet. Not a bad nose to start off with. On the palate, the first two things I'm met by there are the really bold acidity, actually. This is presumably a wine that is intended to be aged, perhaps somewhat more than, what are we now, just under 4 years, and perhaps drinking this a little bit young. And a fair amount of tannic mouthfeel to that, surprisingly tannic, at least that first sip. So again, the house style that I'm familiar with from Fourrier is very light extraction. Both the colour and some notes there on the nose and that sort of surprisingly tannic mouthfeel there suggests that this isn't your sort of typical Fourrier. The tannins have a sort of papery feel, almost like brown paper texture on the roof of my mouth. What I do rather like about it is there's a nice mineral note on the palate, and that is something that I recognise from other Fourrier wines, so that's pretty appealing. It does have a nice weight to it, but my usual favourite adjective of wines being silky. I feel like that doesn't really quite apply here because it has that sort of brown papery tannic finish. I'm getting more sort of plummy kind of notes on the nose now. Definitely more dark berry fruit overall. Not the sort of dainty light cherry I might have expected from a Fourrier. It is nicely concentrated, bit of a mixed bag so far, but perhaps this is something that needs a bit of time to breathe, a bit of time to develop in the glass. Some of those slightly, I wouldn't want to say harsh edges, rough edges, slightly more abrasive edges, like the that kind of papery tannic finish, have possibly softened now, moving on to the second glass, or maybe I've just acclimatized to them. And I'm enjoying this a bit more. I'm getting a slightly fruitier mouthfeel now. It's a more sort of condensed, concentrated fruit now, and it's almost slightly sort of Nuit Saint-Georges like some of those Gavinier Nuit Saint-Georges with that sort of nice, pure, quite intense fruit expression. I think it feels more heavily extracted than I would expect the norm for the Fourrier house style to be. Thicker, fruitier, and a bit more dense, which is interesting, but it's not bad, it's not unpleasant. I feel like I ought to be reaching some conclusions about what I think about this wine. It isn't what I expected it to be, but I do actually quite like it. I may have given some preamble at the start about, oh, this gives you a wonderful insight into the house style at Fourrier. I don't think it does. I don't think this gives you any kind of sense of what a Fourrier Gevrey Chambertin is going to be like. Could be partly to do with the fact this is still relatively young, but I have had these Bourgogne Rouges from other vintages and generally drank them pretty young as well, sort of 3 years old-ish. I always thought they had a bit more sort of subtlety and delicacy. This is a surprisingly big wine for Fourrier, but I don't mind it. I'm actually kind of enjoying it in its own right. Cheers.